I'm Tamika, and today I'm here to talk to you about finding that balance between conservation objectives and managing for bushfire risk. So I don't think anyone here would argue with me that wildfire has become one of the most talked about threats to both humans and to wildlife within Australia, particularly when you think about things like how fire weather is only expected to become even more severe as we move into the future. A reality that is thrown into sharp focus by the 2019-2020 Black Summer of Fire. So this Black Summer, we saw the most numbers of fires started as well as area burnt in the last 20 years. And this fire event is going to have repercussions and damaging effects that are going to be seen for generations. So with that in mind, it's really thrown the spotlight back onto fire as a tool for land management. And in an attempt to find a silver lining in the face of an otherwise devastating bushfire event, it's really led to a huge push and boom in research into planned burning and best practice around planned burning. And better still, this boom in research is starting to filter down to land managers and guide how land managers use fire in flammable systems. I once read an article titled, "There's only one way to make a bushfire less powerful, to take out the stuff that burns." And whilst this is potentially an oversimplification of what planned burning is about, it did really stick and resonate inside my head. I mean, that's what fuel hazard reduction is, right? You take out the stuff that burns. So the leaf litter, the bark, the thatch, and the dead material. And hence you can knock out a corner of that fire triangle. And in a perfect world, you prevent bushfires from sustaining themselves. However, that's sort of where the simplicity ends, because in reality, you need to be thinking about considerations like, where do we burn to reduce the bushfire's risk? How often do we burn to maintain reduced fuel loads? How much do we burn to have a landscape scale impact? And what season do you burn in to reach fuel management zone coverage targets? And whilst this is by no means an exhaustive list, it does start to build a pretty complex picture of what a successful planned burning regime looks like. So the other side of this prescribed burning coin is the ecological costs and benefits. So we know that a lot of Australian animals have adapted for fire. In fact, in order to maintain biodiversity, a lot of ecosystems actually crave it when it's done right. And similar to fuel hazard management, in order to successfully use fire for ecological benefits, there are some key considerations that you need to be thinking about. But as your objectives change, so too do the answers to these questions. And I think that's why, at least within more recent history, they've been treated as mutually exclusive, as though one can only occur at the cost of the other, because they have different answers to the same questions. Why shouldn't we strive for marrying the two by tackling fuel management programs while still achieving those ecological goals? For example, I want to take you to the moorlands of Tasmania, to the buttongrass fields. So these buttongrass fields are thought to kind of form from a frequent burning of like the mosaic style as a time since fire. And these mosaic burnt fields support a really large array of species such as the ground parrot, which is pictured here. In comparison, I want to talk about the buttongrass found in our own Carlisle heath. So this buttongrass was also historically reported to form that kind of field-like structure and also supported its own populations of ground parrots. But over time, we haven't really had the same fire history. So instead of frequent burning the mosaic style, it's kind of only seen fire in the form of large wildfire events in the last 100 years anyway. And what we've also observed is that slowly it's been dominated by these woody shrubs. So things like Melaleuca sporosa have really come up. And what these woody shrubs do is they really elevate the elevated fuel load within this area. And that's going to really drive up fire intensity if a wildfire comes through. The other thing we've noticed is that ground parrots aren't really found in the Carlisle anymore. But what if we could return it back to that buttongrass field-like structure? We could, one, bring down fuel loads and reduce the risk of bushfire in this area, but also potentially introduce species back like the ground parrot and drive up biodiversity. And so that's what my project's really about, not just addressing that ecological aspect and not just talking about the fuel hazard management but trying to find a way to balance the two. So our focal area is one of the two main heathlands found within the Otways, the Carlisle Heath. And as Mark talked about, it's one of the last strongholds for a lot of small threatened mammals, such as the long-nosed potteroo or the southern brown bandicoot. It's also one of the region's greatest risks of catastrophic bushfire due to lightning strikes and its highly flammable vegetation type, such as the grass tree or xanthuria, which dominates a lot of the heathy woodland vegetation area there. It's also got a pretty rich fire history. So if you go back to before the year 2000, it's had quite a few large-scale wildfire events that passed through. But in terms of more recent fire history, so the last 20-ish years, there hasn't been a whole lot of either planned burning or wildfire seen here. And that's led to a real buildup of that vegetation, which increases its risk of fire, as well as building that complex habitat structure that Mark talked about. And we think that this complex vegetation habitat is one of the reasons why small mammals can persist at such high numbers here, despite the fact that no predator control is currently underway here. And the reason I'm saying this is because I think that it's of really high importance when you start thinking about why it's important that we nail the fuel management program within this flammable system. So far, we've mostly focused all of our efforts towards the remote sensing camera data, habitat assessment data, and potteroo trapping and GPS tracking. And what we're trying to do with all of this information is really build that novel information base about what the Carlisle system looks like and what it's doing. And hopefully we're going to be able to take this information and use it to really have a well-informed burning regime within the Carlisle. But all of this data kind of just focuses on that ecological aspect. And conservation isn't the only objective here. And I know I've said it multiple times already, but what we want is that balance. We want to integrate our research with an operational fuel management program. So one approach to identifying how effective a burn regime is at reducing the impact of a bushfire is through fire behaviour modelling. So that is when you can simulate a fire in the landscape and get a representation of what its extent and intensity would be under the various burn regimes. So what we've gone and done is identified 4 potential burning regimes you could implement, and they are no fire management of any kind occurs in the Carlisle. High coverage burns are common practice, around 60 to 80% of available fuels are consumed. Large patchy burns are common practice, so around 30 to 60% coverage, and small patchy burns are common practice with around 30 to 60% coverage. And so once we identified these 4 different strategies, we can then simulate them and visually see how they're going to influence fire within the Carlisle. Traditionally, here in Victoria, we use Phoenix Rapid Fire to do a lot of the bushfire behaviour modelling. And that takes inputs such as forest fuel loads, the terrain, weather conditions, and suppression techniques to simulate a single fire's development and progress under these certain conditions. But that doesn't really quite address the question that we're trying to specifically ask. So what we want to know is how effective our regimes are at reducing the impact and the risk of bushfires over a time period. And so as a way of addressing this temporal element of our research question, we're collaborating with Trent Penman's lab at Melbourne University, and we're going to be using the Fire Regime Operations Simulation Tool, which is a fire regime modelling tool based off of Phoenix. So rather than simulating just a single fire event, what Frost can do is simulate many fires, both planned burns and wildfires, over a designated time period. And this means that we can kind of gain insights into how these burns interact and how they're going to influence future fires within the Carlisle. As an example, I have one of the types of outputs you can get from Frost here, and this isn't based off of our own research. This is something that was given to me from Trent Penman's lab. And I put a red outline here that represents the Carlisle Heath, just to give you some context. So this depicts fire frequency over a 50-year simulation, where the red indicates areas of really high fire frequency and the blue indicates areas of low fire frequency. And without going into too much detail, I think you can already see a pretty interesting picture of which areas of the Carlisle are susceptible to fire and where it's going to be seen the most compared to the areas of blue. So by simulating wildfire events under these 4 different burning regimes, we hope to gain insights into what kind of impact they're going to have at moderating bushfire events when they come through. And if we can combine these simulation outputs with the on-the-ground burning program that's already underway within the Carlisle, we're going to have some real-world application for our fuel management. So looking towards the future, we want to combine this fuel hazard information that we've kind of gathered, and we want to integrate it back with the ecological aspects. So one of the ways we're going to go about doing this is through taking our fire behaviour simulation outputs and incorporating them into a population viability analysis. So a population viability analysis, or a PVA, is a way of assessing the risk that a population will go extinct in X number of years. And we're fortunate enough, I'm sure you've heard now through Mark's talk, to be able to gather this population data for potoroos within the Carlisle. So what we want to hopefully do is take this population information and incorporate it into our PVA to better inform the population dynamics of this model. So taking a step back from all this model talk, why do we want to take things like burn frequency, burn extent, and fire intensity and incorporate them into a population model? Well, what we hope to do is identify the threshold points for disturbance. So what I mean by that is by taking these fire outputs and inserting them into the PVA as a disturbance event, we hope to identify the point where the disturbance caused by fire to a potoroo habitat is so great that it causes a population to crash. Now what I mean by that is it goes locally extinct. And obviously here, extinction is the worst case scenario, but if we can identify these threshold points where the disturbance is so great it causes populations to crash, and we can then integrate that with our information about fuel hazard management, we can finally begin to paint a really well-informed picture of what a successful burning regime looks like within this ecosystem that still has conservation goals, at least for the small mammals. But fauna are not our only thing that's going on in the Carlisle. We're also looking at flora. So stepping away from the charismatic little potoroos, one of the other things we want to focus on is vegetation surveys. So traditionally, most of the fire seen within the Carlisle has either been in the summer, as in large-scale bushfire events, or during spring and autumn as planned burning, which is the traditional planned burning season. But the regime we're currently working on is more of a winter burning program. So the difference there is that generally winter burning is of lower intensity. And what I mean by lower intensity in this instance is that all of that surface fuel isn't always consumed. So there's things like thatch and some leaf litter always left over. And what we want to monitor is if this thatch and leaf litter is going to impact flora species germination and species richness. So we're going to be carrying out flora surveys over the next few years. I think, so finally, I just want to say that I think fire is a pretty undeniably important tool in terms of Australian land management, both for biodiversity conservation and to manage the increasing risk of bushfires. But we're still really trying to work at understanding what this looks like at that finer scale of an ecosystem. And so my parting comment is this: plants and animals will tell us what they need if we listen. And through this research, we really intend to listen. Thank you.
Thanks, Tamika. Are you unsharing as we speak?
I am working towards it.
So far, you've got off scot-free from, oh no, there is a question for you. What spatial area are you planning to run the PVA? So the Carlisle Heath region or broader, Tamika?
So yeah, we're just going to run it for the Carlisle Heath region, and we're even looking at running it for just burn block specific at the moment. But yeah, mostly focusing on that Carlisle Heath region. Sorry, I'm just, all right. All right. Stop screen sharing, by the way.
Now it's a big view of your head, unfortunately, Tamika. It's not unfortunately, but it's intimidating, isn't it, really? At this stage, you've got no other questions, but you're also doing some vegetation analysis as well, and are you planning to build that into the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So we want to look at species germination and richness in the burn blocks, but also we're looking at looking at the different burn histories across the Carlisle and getting a way to measure habitat structure and I guess the fuel load and things like that at the different burn histories.
Yeah, great. You might be off the hook, mate. Thank you very much for your presentation. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you.